Okay, well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us online. My name's Katie Hill and I work for the Global Ocean Observing System and also the Global Climate Observing System. And I sit here in Geneva at the World Meteorological Organization. So just a bit of an outline of our format today. We're going to have about a presentation that will run for about half an hour, and that will give us around half an hour for comments and discussion and questions. So as you think about questions during the session, please type them into the chat room, and then we can go through those questions once the presentation is finished. Okay, so we will then finish at around within around an hour from now. So it's now 1 p.m. European time. So let me just introduce our speaker for today. Online we have Tim Maltman. Tim is the director of Australia's Integrated Marine Observing System, which is one of the GOOS Regional Alliances also. And he is currently chair of the GOOS Regional Alliances Council that works to coordinate across the GRAs and work on areas of common synergy. So I'll just hand over to you, Tim. Take it away. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katie, and welcome to everyone online tonight. And thanks for this opportunity to talk about the GOOS Regional Alliances. Just an outline of the webinar. We'll cover four things. Just introduce the GRAs as we call them. Talk about how we work together and the current status of the GRAs. We'll then talk a little bit about the framework for ocean observing, which is key to, I think, reinvigorating GOOS and making it very relevant to society, and the role that the GRAs are looking to play in that process. And then I'll finish up by talking a bit about our current priorities and next steps. So, by way of introduction, GRAs exist under the auspices of the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, or the IOC of UNESCO, and there is actually a policy around a GOOS regional policy. They were first formed back in the early 90s, although the most recent addition to the GRAs was in 2014 when IMOS, the system, that national system I'm responsible for in Australia, but that works regionally in the Southern Hemisphere, was added into the GRA network, which has been a fantastic thing for our system. The GOOS regional policy was revised back in 2013, and that was really after the 2011 reform of GOOS structure. So that's when we brought into play a new GOOS steering committee, the 3 expert panels, and so on. And it made sense, I think, at that point or shortly after, to review the GOOS regional policy. And I think a point I really want to stress here and come back to several times is that the GRAs really see themselves as part of the new GOOS. We're very excited by this vision of GOOS not just being about physics for climate, but being about ecosystems for society, coming fully into biology and ecosystems, coming onto continental shelves and into coasts. And we think the GRAs have a lot to offer in that way of working. So historically, the regional alliances were introduced as a way to integrate national needs into a regional system and to deliver the benefits of that global strategy and structure and programs. But I think it's fair to say that the GRAs have evolved to meet a wide range of societal challenges, and we'll talk quite a bit about both the similarities and differences, and that those are related to both coastal and open ocean observations. And so it's quite understandable that the GOOS regional policy, last reviewed in 2013, has evolved to reflect the GRAs as they exist today. So here's the way that we represent ourselves. These are the 13 regional alliances in those red boxes. And so just, I guess from the top left-hand corner, there's a Euro GOOS, a Mediterranean GOOS, Black Sea GOOS, GOOS Africa, Indian Ocean GOOS, Northeast Asian GOOS, Southeast Asian GOOS, IMOS, Pacific Island GOOS, US IOS, Caribe GOOS, and then GRASP, which covers the western side of the South American continent, and Ocean Land, which covers more the eastern side. So you'll see that there's 13 plus 2, so we have two other acronyms on that map in white in a different colour in the Arctic and in the Southern Ocean. So Seon and SUS are not currently GOOS Regional Alliances, but they're doing GOOS GRA type work, and so we've certainly invited them into our discussions, and they're engaging with us, which is great. And it may be that at some point they become GRAs or not. We don't really necessarily see that as the main issue. For example, in the Southern Ocean, which I know well, there's an Antarctic treaty system which provides a way for countries to work together that perhaps doesn't so much need the ISC structures that are very beneficial in other parts of the world. So there may be reasons why SUS isn't a GRA, but I think it's important to note that they're on the map. They're working they're doing very similar things, and we're trying to work with them and benefit from what they bring and what they contribute as well. So I just put those little red speakers in there to show that if you look back at the history of GOOS webinars over the last few years, the GRAs have been very active in presenting webinars, and so there is a nice rich body of information about the GRAs on the GOOS website under the webinar tab. So please, if tonight any of this piques your interest about particular systems, then go back and have a look at those, and we would hope that some of our other GRAs will present in this series into the future. So how do we work together, and what's the current status? So there's probably three major ways that the GRAs try and work together. We have a forum, a face-to-face meeting, which is held every 2 years. We have intersessional teleconferences, which we're now trying to do quarterly. And I think increasingly we're involved in out-of-session work that to date has largely involved things like analysis and review, but we're trying to move towards projects that can actually kind of make a difference on the ground. So just to talk about those three things in a bit more detail, as I said, we have a GOOS Regional Alliance Forum face-to-face every 2 years, and so you can see there the history of those over the last about 15 years. And you see we've done a pretty good job in positioning them in different parts of the globe. We think that's a really important part of this work, that we ought to be bringing people together in places where hopefully that can help to spread the GOOS message in those regions and support our colleagues trying to do this kind of thing in various parts of the world. You'll see there that our upcoming meeting is in Singapore in September, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, and that's the 8th meeting in this series. So we had a successful 7th meeting in Heraklion in Crete in September 2015. That was a really well-attended meeting. I think we had all bar one GOOS Regional Alliances present. But I think what was really great about that meeting, and it's something that we want to build on into the future, is that we had a strong presence from the GOOS office and from the GOOS steering committee and from the GOOS expert panels. Not all, but representatives from the panel system. And I think having them meet with us was really beneficial. I think they learnt quite a bit about the GRAs and what they can offer, but we certainly learnt quite a bit about GOOS and the other parts of its work and how we can connect and contribute to that. The report from that meeting is available on the GOOS website if you're interested, and we came up with 29 actions from that meeting, and I think we've really followed through well on those through our quarterly teleconferences, where we're trying to not just meet and write actions and come back in 2 years and then discover we haven't done any of those things. We really are trying to set a plausible number of things to do and get on them and do them and make a difference. I did this little map for the people in my office that have been trying to organise those teleconferences, and it does give you a sense of how difficult it is to do this globally. And I think people in the GOOS office and just trying to organise this webinar tonight, it's a very challenging thing we're trying to do here across scales and time zones, and it's good to remind ourselves of that. But I think the important thing is that within the GRA Council and the way we work, we try really hard to make sure everyone does feel included, and that it's not biased, I guess, towards particular parts of the world. So our teleconferences are very much focused on the actions from our last forum, trying to make sure we are following through on things, and then identifying new initiatives and projects to undertake. In terms of the session work, I think that's been particularly important in reinvigorating the GOOS Regional Alliances over the last few years, and I think I think it's fair to say that we have been reinvigorated, and that GOOS as a whole has been. So I've undertaken a series of analysis and review activities that have helped us to understand the strengths and weaknesses across the GRAs and to focus our effort accordingly. I think one of the things I'll explain here is that there's a lot of heterogeneity between those regional alliances, and there's some strength in that and some weakness, and we need to understand that if we're to work with those things. So probably three things I'd highlight. Back in 2013, we did some assessments of our capability for each of the GRAs, and Zdenka Willis, who was the chair of the GRA Council before me from USOs, now retired, and her support, Laura Griesbauer, led that work, which was great. Then in 2015, we undertook a modelling inventory, and I'd particularly like to thank Patrick Gorringe and colleagues in GOOS who have done some nice work to map that, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And I think it does help to demonstrate that there's a lot of modelling capability in our GRAs as well, and I think that's important for the future. And then we had a formal review of the GOOS Regional Alliances done in 2015 by Linda Glover, and that review was supported by Eric Lindstrom from NASA through his GOOS Steering Committee role, and we're very thankful for that work. Andrew McCurdy also helped with that review, and that was very useful to us. So just to talk a little bit about the Glover review, one of the things that was very helpful was that it helped us to understand that there were 4 basic governance structures for the GRAs and kind of 3 funding models. And we tended to talk a little bit in the past about developed or more developed or less developed GRAs, which I think was somewhat unhelpful terminology. It sounded a little bit judgmental in some ways. And so I think it was really useful to go back to the facts and look at how the GRAs were governed and funded. And so in terms of governance, we have some are associations of institutions which have a memorandum of understanding. You can see the examples there. Some are national programs that are either legislated or have programmatic funding. We have one that's an international not-for-profit organisation, and then we have several that are intergovernmental networks. That's the most common structure. That's not surprising, I guess, if you think about the genesis of GRAs coming out of the IOC, but you can see that through time a number of different models have been implemented around the world, all of which have strengths and weaknesses. And then in terms of funding, 3 broad models. Some have regular funding. Obviously that's a pretty desirable position to be in. Some have been successful in securing project funding to do certain activities. Some are basically unfunded activities at the moment, and that is an issue for us. So, we were just able to sort of plot those 2 things on a simple matrix, and it just helps to show that we go across that spectrum from national or multinational not-for-profits that have a regular funding base through to a number that have been able to get some project funding in the past, but I would say all of those GRAs would love to see more effort going into their regions, and then we have a couple where we really we don't have any funded activity, and I think we need to think very hard about how we might improve that situation through time, and we've got some ideas about that. So one of the things that really made us think about was that if you look at that heterogeneity, it's almost impossible to think of a project that could engage all 13 of the GOOS Regional Alliances, and so we started to think that it was perhaps more realistic to think about subgroups of GRAs to come together to work on pilot projects, particularly if we could get somewhere, we had things that were perhaps fairly well funded and supported, working with those less so. And those blue dotted circles and ellipses are meant to, they're just indicative, but I will talk about a few projects that we're scoping up. But it really was a way of thinking. Say, if I think about the part of the world I come from, we have Pacific Island goose that's trying to cover an enormous percentage of the ocean with very limited resources. The US has a Pacific Island activity. IMOS has interest in the Pacific. We also work with people like the New Zealanders and the French. Can we come together to work in a way that would actually help to lift the ocean observing effort and deliver some societal benefit in that region? Can we think of ways to do that? So I think the review and analysis work that we did was really helpful to us in thinking, well, we probably need to change the way we operate, and we think this is really quite a good way to go forward. And I'll talk about that a bit more. The other thing that the review and analysis work helped to highlight is that the GRAs have actually embraced a lot of new observing networks. And if you look up in the top right-hand corner, I've just got that little graphic of the canonical view of GOOS with its the Argo floats and the tropical moor buoy array and so on. But as we'll discuss a little further, there are many other ocean observing networks that are being used, and GRAs have been quite, I think, active in embracing some of these. For example, ocean gliders, high frequency radar, animal tagging and monitoring, water quality, and ocean acidification. And we now know from doing that assessment that we have, in some cases, up to half of our GRAs active in operating those kind of networks. And so that's something that we think we can bring to GOOS, and I'll come back to that a bit more. The other thing it's really helped to highlight, as I mentioned before, is that we now know the GRAs have a lot of modelling capability, particularly those that have perhaps a more kind of operational focused GRAs like EuroGOOS, Mongoose, IUS and others. As I said, Patrick Orange and colleagues in EuroGOOS have developed a really nice tool which has kind of enabled us to map those model domains out, and there's lots of great information there about the various models that are available. And you can see the little link down there at the bottom that you can hit on, and if you go to the EuroGOOS website you'll be able to find that quite easily, and that's a nice resource that we've been able to develop and we hope to grow and improve through time. So now I want to move and talk a little bit about, I guess, that's largely backward looking about where the GRAs have come from, how we're currently working together and the status. And I'd really now like to start to talk, perhaps look forward a little bit and talk about the framework for ocean observing and the role of the GOOS Regional Alliances in that. And I think there's a growing number of people on the webinar, which is great. I can see a number of names there. I'm sure many of you, most if not all of you, know about the framework. It's described as a simple system with input, process and output, and it's about setting requirements, about undertaking the observations required, and then about developing data and products as outputs. And what we've tried to do, really starting I guess with the Ocean Obs 09 conference, and then development of the framework through to about 2011, and then implementation through the last 5 years or so, is really about trying to bring GOOS from that historical strength of physics for climate into meeting a much broader set of societal drivers for the next decade. So not just about climate and weather, but about fisheries, about regional priorities, real-time services, management of ecosystem services, and so on. And in order to achieve that, you'll see in the red text in there that's going to require expanded requirements and new essential ocean variables. If we're to do that, it's going to require expanded observing systems and networks, and it's going to require new data and products. I think if we talk about the requirements and expanded EOVs, I think within GOOS the process for that is quite clear with the 3 expert panels. There's been a lot of effort going into establishing not just a physics panel or an ocean carbon panel, but physics coming into shelves and coasts, true biogeochemistry and biology and ecosystems, which is genuinely kind of new for GOOS, I guess. So we can see how that requirement setting is being done through the panels, and so there's a process there we can interact with. But I think when it comes to expanding the observing systems and networks and then eventually delivering new data products to meet those requirements, that's much less clear. And I think that's where the GRAs have really been putting their hands up saying, we want to be part of the solution here. We really think that we've got something to offer, and we're excited by what the framework is laying out for us. And so I'll talk a little bit about how we've tried to contribute to that and how we hope to do that into the future. So that leads me to talk, I guess, about GRA priorities and next steps. So probably 4 things I'll talk about here. First of all, about GOOS pilot projects. So I think as part of that reinvigoration of GOOS from Ocean Obs 09 through the framework and so on, one of the ways that has been conceived to drive things forward is through pilot projects. Tropical Pacific Observing System 2020 is one of those. The Deep Ocean Observing System is another, or Deep Ocean Observing Strategy, I think it is another. Atlantis, I don't think is actually seen as a GOOS pilot project, but I think many of us are very interested in the work Atlantis is doing, which seems very relevant to what we're trying to do here. And so I guess sitting out there in the GRAs, we wanted to understand, well, how are we able to propose pilot projects in the GOOS? What's the process to do that? And because we really think that's it's a good process, and we'd like to be part of it. And as I said, we think we've got something to contribute. And so we've worked with the GOOS Office and Steering Committee to develop a process for pilot projects, and I'll talk about one example in a minute. And I think that's been valuable because when we started that discussion, there really wasn't a process for that to happen. And so I think the GRAs have been able to contribute to that. And I think the message we're trying to give here is that we do provide a resource that we would like the global ocean observing community to take advantage of, but also help us out in our work as well. The other bit is that, as I said, we're very motivated to propose new networks in the GOOS. That classic view of GOOS is going to have to change if we're going to measure these new variables and deliver broader societal benefit. And so we've been active in supporting the development of HF high frequency radar as a potential element of GOOS, supporting the ocean glider community. We're very interested in ocean acidification, animal tracking, and other things through time. And then the final piece is around the essential ocean variables and how it's one thing to specify and define variables, but in terms of how they're actually measured and how those measurements find their way into products and services, we think the GRAs have a lot to offer there as well. So I'll just talk a little bit in a bit more detail about those 4 priority areas. So I'm back to that diagram before with the light blue circles and ellipses. So the one pilot project we've developed to date is called MESCAT, a Mediterranean Sea Level Change and Tsunamis project. And what that's really about is that it's been led by Enrique Fanful from Mongoose, but with support from colleagues in EuroGOOS and GOOS Africa. You would think the Mediterranean's a pretty well observed part of the global ocean, but in fact, when you look at what's available, there's a real paucity of observations along the southern margin for important things around such as sea level and tsunami. And I guess you can think about some of the geopolitical reasons as to why that might be the case. And so MESCAT really is a project conceived to try and address that, and we think that GOOS and its IRC mechanisms have a lot to offer us in that way. So we've gone through the process of developing that project. It isn't yet funded, but where Enrique and colleagues are working hard to try and find some ways to get support for that. The 2 other examples that were a little less developed, but I think we'll progress these at a meeting in Singapore in September. One around Pacific waves and coastal inundation. So I mentioned before that the Pacific Islands have, as we would know from the Ocean Conference last week, are really making it very clear to the world that ocean observations are incredibly important to their future, and they're challenged on that front. And I think it's up to countries like Australia, US, New Zealand, France, and others that work in that region to come together to help them with that. And we've got some ideas about how we could improve wave and coastal inundation forecasting in that region. And another one which has come up recently was discussed at the GA Blue Planet symposium in Maryland a couple of weeks ago, is what's called the 4M project around multi-purpose marine monitoring mechanism in the Caribbean. That's a project that really is embracing the framework for ocean observing, and we expect to be discussing that one as well in the at the GOOS Regional Alliance Forum in September. I really need to point out that these aren't meant to be exclusive. We hope through time to find these kind of projects that are contributing something to all of our GRAs. As I said, but the idea is that they are so different that there's no one project we can think of that would benefit them all. And so we think this is a more pragmatic way of moving forward. as I said, none of those projects are funded yet. One is quite well developed. The others are in the pipeline, and so I guess that's an experiment, and we'll see whether or not that is something that's successful through time in terms of getting new resources to do new projects that deliver new things. Coming back to this issue about GRAs embracing new networks, we're really the first thing we've been working on is around high frequency radar. So under GEO there was a task team that was set up there, and we've really worked with them and the GOOS office and steering committee to say, well, okay, let's use this as a pilot. How would something like high frequency radar that we think has a lot to contribute to essentialization variables around, for example, boundary currents, how would that, what is the process for that being assessed as a new element of GOOS? And so if you look back up to that map in the top right hand corner, would that map in the future have a radar panel in it, and we'd have some idea about what a global design for radar might look like, and we know where we're at with implementation of that. Gliders are the next cab off the rank under the leadership of Pierre Testor. I think that they're really doing some good work to try and bring the glider communities together, and the GRAs really want to support that. As you can see, 7 of our 13 GRAs have active glider programs already, so we think we have quite a bit to offer. Ocean acidification is another thing where Global Ocean Acidification Observing Network is doing some great work. They, for example, have an idea about developing regional nodes, and so we think, well, gee, if we've got GOOS Regional Alliances, can we work with GOON to help them in their aspiration to have a stronger regional presence, and also then leverage off some of what's already happening in some of the GRAs, but helps build new capability in other GRAs. For example, that's I would say quite a big issue in South American countries where perhaps more capability could be built. And then another one that we'd like to look at is around animal tagging and monitoring. They have some time ago through the Ocean Tracking Network proposed to be a part of GOOS. That didn't go so well at the time, and I think that's something that we kind of like to come back to and over time. So as I said, I think that the GRAs feel quite strongly that we are operating these kind of networks now. We see value in them, and we would like to try and bring that value to GOOS more broadly. The final piece is around taking a essentialization variable view across the GRAs. So that's very much where in the reinvigoration of GOOS, where a lot of the effort's been to date around reforming the steering committee, around forming the 3 expert panels, and particularly getting the physics panel more into the shelves and coasts. The biogeochemistry panel really focused on biogeochemistry, not just carbon, and establishing the biology and ecosystems panel from scratch. And so there's something like 27 or so essentialization variables now across those 3 panels. Some GRAs have had an EOV view since their inception. IUS, the American system, has. IMOS has to some extent. In fact, Katie Hill, who's moderating this meeting, had quite a lot to do with that when she was out working with us in Australia. And so what we'd really like to do is sort of have a look at, well, what are those essentialization variables that the 3 panels are talking about? How do they compare to the GRAs that are measuring or think they're measuring EOVs? Where are they common and different? Where can the work that the GOOS panels help the GRAs to focus and develop their efforts? And where can the GRAs who have that EOV view contribute back into the panels to say, well, this is our experience of actually trying to measure that variable and turn it into useful data and products. That works quite early stage, but we'll discuss that at our September meeting, and that might be something that we give a bit more emphasis to in our activities, say, in the next couple of years. So again, we just think this is a useful role the GRAs can play as an integrator. In some respects, GRAs are trying to operate mini GOOSes in their own regions, and so we think they're particularly useful part to test out and contribute to GOOS more broadly, but also I think obviously to ourselves to benefit from the massive effort that goes around the globe. None of us are trying to sit in our own regions and make it up and reinvent the wheel. So that's pretty much the what I wanted to run through tonight. Hopefully it's clear. I wanted to introduce the GRAs and make sure you understand what they are and how what they are and where they've come from. We've tried to explain how we're working together and where we're at the moment. We've talked about the framework for ocean observing and the new GOOS and the role that the GRAs hope to play there. And we've talked a bit about our current priorities and next steps. Just a bit of a plug for our 8th forum. It will be held in Singapore on the 5th to 7th of September 2017. We hope that'll be well attended again. We're aiming to get all the GRAs there. And as I said earlier, we've got commitments from the GOOS Office and Steering Committee and panels to be there, and we found that really useful, and I think they did too. So it's really, I think all of us should be trying to use these fora to help drive that integration across the GOOS enterprise. I think one of the things that we're excited about in the meeting is that we've had a great response from our colleagues. So we'll have a session on ocean gliders, we'll have a session about ocean radar, we've got the Global Ocean Certification Observing Network people coming. The Argo program, which is familiar to all of you, really wants to look at extending into regional seas, and they're interested in talking to the GRAs about how we might help with that. We've got the JCOM Office Coordination Group represented. We've got the G'day Ocean View Forecasting and Modelling Group represented. And again, I think if you think back to the work we've done to demonstrate the modelling and forecasting capability that does exist in the GRAs, that's a good link. We've got a bit of a focus on the Large Marine Ecosystems program. Again, they have a regional view of the ocean, as do the GRAs. So they're things that we could do together. And I think, excitingly, there's some really good new national efforts spinning up in places like South Africa and Canada. If you hark back to what we said about GOOS Africa, at the moment that's largely an unfunded activity, whereas at least in the southern part of the continent, there's some really good things happening in the South African Environmental Observation Network, or SAON. And so I think it would be great for us to find a way to embrace that, work with those colleagues, help them and get them contributing into what we're trying to do. Similarly, if you look at North America, I mean, we have IOS operating really well in around the east and west and southern coasts of America, and then up in Alaska. But we have Canada, which is a really powerful country, does a lot of fantastic marine science and ocean observing that's not currently engaged in our GOOS enterprise in that kind of way. So we're very interested in trying to find ways to embrace those activities, and we hope to do more of that through time. And again, we'll produce a report from that meeting that will be available to share. And I would just like to thank our hosts from the National University of Singapore. We're very thankful for the support they're giving us to run the meeting there. So, Katie, that's pretty much what I wanted to say this evening. So, thank you for the time, and I'm happy to try and answer your questions.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was a great overview of the GRAs and the connection, I think, between the GRAs and some of the opportunities and efforts which are progressing globally. So just as a reminder, if you have any questions for Tim, please type them into the chat. And so while people are thinking, one question I'd like to ask is around the connection between the GOOS Regional Alliances and the efforts of the global expert panels of GOOS. And some work has been done to develop the GOOS EOV specifications. And do you have any thoughts and comments on the utility of those for the GRAs, and how the GRAs might also feed back into that specification process?
Yeah, Katie, so I think one of the points I raised was that we've at least started some mapping, I guess, of the EOVs that the GRAs are observing and those that are against those that the panels have identified to date. Not all GRAs have an EOV view of the world, and that's something I think would have come through my presentation, that we, as I said, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the GRAs. We've just learnt to, I guess, be relaxed about that and find the strengths in that. So we're trying to have a portfolio of activities that there's something in it for every GRA, but not every GRA needs to be involved in every activity. So certainly for IMOS and IUS, who have a strong EOV perspective, we're very interested in engaging with the panels on that. For example, we are trying to measure some of the new EOVs, particularly that the GOOS BioEco panel is proposing, say around zooplankton, for example. So we think we think that's a very fertile space for us to work together, and we'll discuss in September whether there are other GRAs who want to engage in that that process of having an EOV view through what they do. And as I said, we think we benefit a lot from the work of the panels. I mean, they are some of the best people in the world on these issues, and so we've sort of made a best effort to start on some of these things. But we certainly think that we'll benefit a lot from the expertise that the panels are bringing.
Thank you, Tim.
I'm
happy to read out the question.
There's a few comments in there that I can respond to.
I'm happy to read out the questions, and so that those online can hear as well, and you can respond. So, particularly, Venkat has a question, and I think you noted that there are some national systems which are spinning up. Particularly, you mentioned South Africa and Canada, which might present some real opportunities in those regions. And Venkat noticed that also the India's national program, the Ocean Observing Network, OON, could be added. This is a government program fully funded and has all the components of observations. It's now 20 years old. So perhaps you can comment on the connection, the relationship between GRAs and national programs and activities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great comment from Venkat, and we welcome that. I think to some extent the view that is being presented of the GRAs there is historical, and I think particularly as GOOS invigorates and tries to go through truly biophysical and truly open ocean into coast, that I think it's really important that we do embrace some of these activities like the one that Venkat highlights. So at the moment, India's engagement in the GRAs tends to be through IOGOOS, so that tends to be the open ocean piece, and that's important. And they're making a great contribution to Rama and other things. But I think what Venkat's highlighting is another set of activity there that's really quite well developed and mature, and we would love to see that more engaged with the GRA network. So it's exactly the sort of thing that we would like to do, and I think it's just that our historical structures are, that's where we've ended up through the IOC processes. But we'd love to think about, well, how could we take full advantage of all that expertise that's going on. So thank you, Venkat, for that, and I think we should discuss that with Satish Shenoy and others.
Great, thank you. That seems like a conversation that will continue offline. Okay, so Tosta Tanhua noticed the Seon on the map, and notes that they don't seem to have a particular marine focus, but more a social science focus. Can you comment on that?
I can't comment a lot, to be honest, Tosta. I mean, I guess as the chair of the Regional Alliance Council, and that's I should have said that's a baton we pass around. So I'm in my second year of doing that job. Zdenka Willis did 2 terms before me for 4 years. I think Hans Darwin from Eurogoose before that. So we share that load around. So I inherited a map that had Seon on it, and Sus. I'm not actually sure where that came from, but I wrote to Jean-René Larsen from Seon and to Louise Newman and others from Sus and said, well, you're interested in talking to us, and Jean-René certainly has come on to 1 or 2 of our teleconferences. I'm also aware from Eric Book in Eurogoose that there is increasing interest in the Arctic, in an Arctic observing system. Yeah, I think Tosta, it would be fair to say that if you think about the discussion we had around, say, the expert panels, how they've evolved, and you know, the OIPC is evolving to have an interest in continental shelves and coasts that it didn't used to have. You know, the old IOCCP, which Tosta knows well, is going from carbon to true biogeochemistry, and bioecosystems, biogen ecosystems has been set up from scratch. I think similarly, we would expect that map of the GRAs to change through time. We're certainly not putting that up as something that's static. I mentioned the TPOS 2020 project. I think Neville Smith is or was on the line. I think there's a great question about, well, when TPOS 2020 is finished as that project and there is an ongoing tropical Pacific observing system, how is that governed? Is that a new kind of GOOS Regional Alliance that would come into being or not? I think similar question in the Atlantic, around Atlantis. So we're very interested in these things, and we think we'd like to be a part of a discussion around that. So I think, you know, don't look at that. You know, we tend to see maps with lines on them as fixed. I don't think the GRA Council think about it that way. And as I said, we're trying to embrace and engage new things. And I think if GOOS is successful in what it's setting out to do under the framework, you know, the panels and the variables will look different, the networks will look different, and the GRAs will look different, and they'll all be better.
Thank you, Tim. Excuse me. So Dennis asked the question. He might provide some clarification if I get the meaning wrong. He's asking, how do we encourage subgroup exchange of GRA experts? I think he's thinking about expertise. Can we exchange or advise across GRAs given the expertise that we have in particular GRAs, and what mechanisms need to be put in place? Dennis, if I've got that wrong, please clarify.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. We talk a lot. I mean, GRAs have got to be about capacity building. That really is a fundamental part of what they're meant to bring. And I think we've got to the point where we don't see capacity building as a separate priority for us. We just see it as an element of every priority that we're trying to pursue. And so I think, I mean, my best answer to Dennis around that is that the way we're trying to think about these pilot projects, like the MESCAT project in the Mediterranean, like what we're thinking about in the Pacific, like what we're thinking about in the Caribbean, they would have a strong element of exchange of expertise. I think it will work best where, as I said, we have a mix of GRAs involved, particularly some that are perhaps have more expertise, are better resourced, and can find ways to share that, and to have all the boats lift on a rising tide, I guess, is what we're trying to do. But to be honest, Dennis, we're thinking about that, and we're experimenting with this pilot project approach, but we're not yet sure that it'll work. So I guess if you have thoughts and ideas about how to help us, it would be great to hear them.
Great, thank you. So your comment to Neville seems to have nudged him into action.
So I'm just reading Neville's question.
So he says the framework is the framework for ocean observing is mostly conceived in terms.
You're going to read a very Neville Smith question for me?
Can you hear me? Hello? Tim, just checking.
You dropped out, Katie, but I can hear you again now.
Okay. Sorry, I was midstream. Hopefully everybody can hear me now.
Yeah, I can hear you now, yes.
All right, so the framework for ocean observing is mostly conceived in terms of global requirements and global solutions. And Neville asks, has anyone redrafted this in terms of regional requirements? So essential ocean variables for a region, required regional observations to meet the demand, and how these observational requirements might be met through a combination of global backbone contributions supplemented by regional specific contributions. In this view, essential has a region by region character, and the sampling requirements and optimum solutions vary by region. What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Noel. So I guess no one's kind of redrafted the framework in a regional context, but the work that we are trying to do in the GRAs is for those of us that have developed EOVs in inverted commas within our own frameworks. And certainly for IMOS and IS, we develop those within a strong socioeconomic context. We're matching those against the global variables to see how where they compare and contrast. So I think we're at least starting to think about that, and it'll be interesting to see what that tells us. I think the other thing that I think is really important about the point you raise is that I think from a GRA perspective, when we talk about the global in GOOS, we're really thinking about a second kind of global here. So if you think about Argo, it's a global design. We know that core Argo, we put one float in every 3 degrees square down to 2,000 metres, and we get meaningful information about subsurface heat and thermal structure and salinity and so on. For a global glider network or radar network, we think it's quite a different kind of issue, that you probably won't have the same kind of global design, but we still think there's enormous value for us to work as a global community operating radar networks and glider networks. A lot of it has to do with things like just the capacity building, the data handling, all the technical challenges, but also then I think if we think about things like boundary currents and trying to answer questions about those, then I think we'll see you could conceive how some of those networks could be contributing to those to an issue around global ocean circulation that has regional manifestation. So that's kind of the best answer I can give you for now, but I think it's a good question, and I think we're excited by, I guess, being contributing to further discussion about that. I certainly think I can say as a GOOS Regional Alliance, we do find the framework very helpful. It's got a lot of great structure in it that we can use regionally, but it's a fair point to say that we're tailoring it and adapting it, and I think that's a good conversation to have with others in other regions.
Great, thank you very much, Tim. So there is actually a comment here just referring to Toster's previous question about SEON, and Eric Buch, who's chair of EuroGOOS, said that SEON as an ocean observing component is not so well funded. There is an Horizon 2020 European project in Taros, which is, I guess, framed in a similar way to Atlantos, that's focused on the Arctic, on Arctic observing. And there is also some discussions about forming an Arctic GOOS as well. So there's plenty of activity moving forward there in the Arctic. So while there's others who are thinking about questions, another question from me is around the GOOS Biology and Ecosystems panel. That's the newest of the expert panels in GOOS. The oldest panel, the OOPC, has just had its 20th meeting, and the BioEco panel has just had its second, and they've identified a core set of what they see as the essential ocean variables and developed specifications. Many of those are in the coastal space. So do you have some comments on how the GRAs can help in connecting up and facilitating the development of the observations for those EOVs, and also vice versa?
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, so I think it's something that in general the GRAs are very excited about. I mean, if you're working in a GRA, you're in coastal systems, and that's where people live and work and play, and where a lot of the impacts play out. And so we think it's great that GOOS is developing into that full biophysical open ocean to coastal system, and I think that the GRAs think they have quite a lot to offer. again, it varies a lot across the GRAs, and so I think, you know, Venkat made a really good point before that there's tremendous capability in India in coastal systems that we're probably not really getting the full benefit of that expertise into the global system at the moment. I mean, I would say that's probably the case in South America, where our engagements with the GOOS Regional Alliances tend to come through the navies around the oceanography. But we know that there's some excellent capability in some of those countries in coastal systems. We're seeing that in Goan, for example, where they have a Latin American network set up. So we're really interested in, that's why we want to talk to people like Goan and others to find ways to connect these up. And at the end of the day, it's about trying to drive that message of the the value of ocean observations globally into all the countries that contribute to that. I mean, I think I think where we need to go with the GRAs and the expert panels, and not just the GRAs, I think, you know, there's networks that should be coming into play here as well, is that we're actually trying to take those measurements. We're trying to measure some of those variables now, and I think that's really where we ought to start to put our focus. You know, for example, we have a global alliance of CPR continuous plankton recorder surveys in GACS. Our program certainly supports that kind of work, but I don't think we really have a global design for that program, and so I'm hoping that the work that the expert panel is doing around zooplankton, for example, will help us to think that through. So to give you one example of how that might come together. Bring it on, I think, is what the GRAs would say.
Oh, great to hear. Okay, so there's another question here from Neville Smith. He asks, how do the GRAs measure or see success, particularly those beyond the regular funding?
Well, I think it would be honest to say, Neville, that I've talked quite a bit about the heterogeneity of the GRAs, and so that tends to suggest that the measures of success will probably vary quite a lot across the GRAs. Some are quite formally intergovernmental. Some are very, some are quite nationally focused but engaging regionally. Some are semi-formal alliances. I mean, I think that it probably comes back to the pilot projects that I talk about. I think we will not, if we cannot conceive and implement pilot projects through time, I think we would see that as not a success. I think we really do want to try and make a difference through what we're doing. So it's a kind of negative way to answer your questions in some respects. But I think I'd come back to the things that I talked about. I think if first of all, are the GRAs seen to be relevant by the GOOS community? I would say, going back a few years, that when GOOS was reinvigorated and the panels were first set up, I don't think there was. I think the view was that the GRAs weren't particularly relevant. We think that's changed quite a bit in the last few years, and so we feel good about that. We think that's some level of success. I think we're trying to propose pilot projects to make a real difference on the ground in regions, particularly those where there isn't as much going on as there could and should be. We're trying to support new networks. We're trying to emphasise the importance of not just the observations but the modelling and forecasting. We're trying to test out the ideas about these EOVs and see whether they really work, in a regional context or not. And so I think at the moment we would measure our success by those kind of measures. Are we getting pilot projects up and implemented? Are we a part of new networks entering GOOS, and those kinds of things? it's probably a good discussion for us to have in terms of, well, how do we see success? But I think it is fair to say that there will be a diverse range of measures simply because there is the GRAs are so diverse, and there is both strength and weakness in that diversity.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim. So one last question from me, if there's no other questions on the chat. And I wanted to raise the challenge of data management and data delivery. Certainly, sitting where I do, I've been involved in quite a few discussions recently about how we manage or guide data management aspects globally while taking advantage of a huge amount of activity bubbling up within the community and connecting. And I wondered if there's been much discussion within the GRAs around the data delivery aspects and enabling GRAs to better deliver their activities.
Again, Katie, there's a very broad range from with things like IMOS. As you know, we run Australia's Ocean Data Network, so we have a very strong focus on data, and we're trying to feed into all the appropriate global databases through to things like GOOS Africa and Caribe Goose that really have no extant capability. So we span all of those things at the moment. I think where we would see the GRAs can most contribute to that issue is, I would say, in things like these new networks, like radars and gliders, oceanification, animal tracking, potentially, where between the GRAs, we're doing a lot of this kind of work now, and we are very keen to commit to working to common data standards and formats and working through what those things need to look like globally. And so we're not sitting back waiting for JCOM or someone else to work that out for us. We certainly want to engage with JCOM OCG and get their help and support. But we're very committed, I think, to working ourselves to common standards, and so I think we'll try and almost organically make a contribution in that way. I think in other respects that might be something with, for example, where we have in some regions where there is very limited capability now, that might be something that we can set up pilot projects to help to transfer some capability in data management. Certainly some of the GRAs that are active in that area now, what they do is open source. It's very transferable, subject to, I guess, having the compute and storage kind of requirements available to do that kind of thing. I mean, it's certainly an issue in places like Africa or the Pacific Islands. Just the network connectivity that we take for granted in some parts of the world simply doesn't exist. So we've got those kind of challenges too. But I think committing to make sure that everything that we're doing, I think particularly, as I said, in the new networks, Argo handles all this beautifully. We just need to work with that. Whereas I think in gliders is a good example. I mean, there's many different types of gliders being flown around the world. Slocums, sea gliders, sprays, so on. But we ought to be able to work together on common data formats and processing and all that kind of stuff, and really contribute to building global data sets where appropriate. So I think that's the way that we would do that. I actually think that if you look at the physics and the biogeochemistry, you can see how most of those kind of data sets will be handled through the kind of systems we have. I think the big challenge is in the biology and ecosystems, where I can't see that it's going to get handled in the same kind of way. And whilst it's great to have OBIS, it's got a long way to go before it could really handle all the sorts of data that we're potentially talking about there. So I think that in that bioeco data is a particular area where I think I'd love to see the GRAs really step up and contribute and benefit but make a difference. And it's great to see people like Lenore from OTN on the line. I think we've got a lot of upside to do in that area.
Great, thank you very much, Tim. And we're hitting close to hitting the top of the hour now. So thank you very much. I know it's getting very late for you over there in Hobart. Thanks very much for your presentation and engaging in the discussion. And thanks very much to everybody online for joining us too.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks everyone, and thanks for your questions. That was great.
Thank you. And just
thanks,
keep
Katie.
an eye on the GOOS
Good night.
webinar list for future notifications of GOOS webinars, and they'll also be advertised on the GOOS website and by Twitter. Thank you very much.